everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My returning guest today, Daniel McInerny, is a philosopher, a novelist, an associate professor and chair of the philosophy department at Christendom College. He also writes the Substack newsletter, The Comic Muse, and he appeared on this podcast not too long ago to discuss his fine novel, The Good Death of Kate Montclair. And today he's back to discuss a work of philosophy that was published by Word on Fire Academic. The title is Beauty and Imitation, a philosophical reflection on the arts. The goal of this book is a recovery of the Aristotelian understanding of art as fundamentally imitative, and further than that, that this imitation is, in all the arts, narrative and moral in nature. This very, very interesting book. I think a lot of people are going to have to contend with this book and take its insights seriously. The theory is quite robust. It's very nuanced. It's probably perfect, in my opinion, when applied to the novel in particular. And also, unlike some past conservative thinkers who followed this kind of mimetic or moral view of art, Daniel McInerny is he's not crudely moralistic, and he's not closed off to a diversity of artistic traditions and styles, which I really appreciated. I do have some disagreements with the book, in particular with regards to the application of this theory to other less obviously narrative art forms. So we're going to have a conversation about all of this, and I'm excited to try to hash some of this stuff out with Daniel McInerny. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm excited as well for this conversation. Thank you for the thoughtful reading you've given my book, and can't wait to talk about it.
Great. Well, let's just start off with a general question of what is the importance, broadly speaking, that you place on reviving this theory of art as imitation?
Yeah. Well, it connects the arts, or what I prefer to call the mimetic arts, the imitative arts. It connects them back to reality. It connects them back to their service to our contemplation of reality and reality specifically under its aspect of beauty. So I think that's the heart of it. It's an understanding of art that is somewhat philosophical, not in the technical scholarly sense, but in the very human sense that we are inquirers into truth. We are made for the contemplation of truth, and we love to contemplate that truth under the aspect of beauty. That's what this tradition of mimetic art is all about.
Great. So when speaking of art as imitation and as conveying truth, as you just said, do you mean that the purpose of a painting is to direct you away from the painting itself to the contemplation of what it depicts?
Great question. We need to make some distinctions here. I borrow from my great teacher at the Catholic University of America, Monsignor Robert Sokolowski, the idea that we can think of the mimetic arts as a kind of picturing. That's certainly the case when we think of arts that are literally picturing, drawing, or painting, but I apply that to all the mimetic arts. So I would think of the novel, the film, dance, and indeed music as a kind of picturing. And a picture has several aspects to it. There is the person who makes the picture, the artist. Sokolowski says that philosophically speaking, the person who makes the picture is the least significant. Maybe we can come back to that thought. Then you have the picture itself. That is, what is composed, what is in the frame, as it were. Then you have the audience that appreciates what's in the frame as a picture. They take it in, not just as any old thing, but as a picture. And then you have, finally, the object, the reality that's being pictured. Now, my understanding of picturing of mimetic art is that the picture is not just merely a means to get to the reality being pictured. That doesn't resonate with our love of art at all, because a big part of our love for the arts is our love for what's in the frame, as it were. We love the structure of the notes. We love Shakespeare's use of rhetorical devices. We love Cézanne's use of color. We love aspects, formal aspects, we might say, of the picturing itself. So we don't just use the picture as a springboard to contemplate the reality beyond the picture. Though having said all that, I would still say that the overall aim of a work of mimetic art is to help us see that reality being pictured in a fresher way, in a way that we haven't seen it before, in a way that delights us. So the reality beyond the picture is of huge, and I would say paramount importance, but it doesn't make the picture itself a mere means, or what I say in the book a little more technically, an instrumental sign.
You suggest that mimesis can actually give us a better insight into something than directly experiencing that thing. Why would that be the case?
Because reality is very complex, especially if you're getting into human action. It's very complex. And we are very dull creatures. We get dulled to that complexity. We start becoming complacent. We start taking it for granted. We fall into ruts in our attention. So we don't see it. So we need our attention to be freshened. We need reality to be packaged in a way that we can intellectually and effectively digest it and appreciate it. So it's both reality's complexity and our own dullness that make art so worthwhile.
To what degree does imitation require resemblance?
Oh, great question. It seems that a work of mimetic art requires a certain degree of resemblance or likeness. That seems to be sort of built into the theory, both as Aristotle understands it, as St. Thomas Aquinas understands it, and as I understand it, that there has to be a basic act of identification. So that if I look at the portrait of Winston Churchill, if I'm going to have the experience of a portrait of Churchill, I have to identify it as Churchill. There has to be enough resemblance there. But the theory of arts being mimetic does not rely merely on an identification with whatever is being pictured. That's just the beginning. That's just the threshold. What's far more interesting and exciting for us is, again, what's happening inside the frame, such that that reality is being offered to us in a way that is exciting and captivating and enthralling. We don't go through art museums, like a portrait museum, as there is one in Washington, D.C., and say, oh, yeah, there's the Churchill, there's the Lincoln, there's the George Washington. I got it. I've identified them. But nonetheless, there has to be some identification. And we can talk about how much there needs to be in order for us to contemplate that reality. So is a Cubist portrait, for example, does that give us enough resemblance, maybe not of a particular person, but at least of a person, for us to have a valuable experience contemplating the piece? Those are fascinating questions.
Yeah, and to be honest, the way that you in the book answer the questions that I've been asking so far is that's the reason that I said, introducing you, that I think you do a lot better job. Your version of this theory is a lot better than the way that conservative writers have often approached art, which is to redirect away from the work, right, to their own thematic discussion, for instance, or to expect an overly sort of an overly realistic bias, for example, when it comes to visual arts, things like that.
Right.
And that's why I think your book is so strong on that.
Thank you. And yeah, let me underscore that. There's nothing in in a mimetic understanding of art that says that, or that requires that painting, for example, or even photography for that matter, needs to be extremely naturalistic. That's one mode. That's one mimetic mode.
Right.
Um, but I can be grabbed, say, by a cubist portrait, or a portrait that at least is not striving for a photorealistic effect. Um, I mean,
Right.
just think of very simple examples like a caricature of somebody. The caricaturist is not after uh, naturalism. He's deliberately trying to exaggerate features of the sensible forms of someone's face. Why? So that we see it, see it anew. We see what's characteristic of it, and sometimes you need to exaggerate.
Right. And again, it depends on the art form, right? So in the book, you mention the difference between theater and film in their relationship to realism, for instance, and particularly to setting. So
Yeah.
each you have to sort of see the art forms are very malleable in this respect, but still there are certain tendencies. You know, a
Mhm.
film doesn't have to be realistic, but it seems to tend in that direction unless it's animation or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah,
Just
I
the
think
nature of the medium.
that's generally true. It's the nature of the medium, and it's the nature of popular taste as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. How would you describe the combination of universality and particularity that a work of art offers?
Oh gosh, great question. One thing I learned, or at least became much clearer to me in writing this book, is the way in which mimetic art helps us to understand sensible particulars. Because, strictly speaking, on the theory of knowledge that I operate under, the one inspired by Aristotle and St. Thomas, we don't, strictly speaking, know particulars. So, behind my camera here, I'm looking out in my yard, I see trees. I can't literally know those particular trees. So, do I give up and just in Platonic fashion excuse myself to abstract forms and sort of forget about particulars? Well, no. Art is one way in which we can, in a sense, know particulars. And what the work of art does is it it combines particularity with what I call in the book mimetic universality. So it gives us a universal. It gives us something true. It gives us an idea or set of ideas, but it embodies that mimetic universal within oil paint or in the movements of and speech of actors on a stage or in prose, so that the sense particulars are elevated, as it were. We get, I like to tell my students, it's like we get this perfect sandwich. We get sense particulars, which being embodied spirits we love. We love sense particulars, but we also get a mimetic universal embedded in those particulars. It's the perfect sandwich for us as human beings. It satisfies our rational nature and our animal nature to a T, and we can't get enough of it. We can't get enough of the arts. That's why we're much more prone to watch a movie on Saturday night than curl up with Immanuel Kant.
So let's talk a bit about story. And you sort of develop your ideas about story and narrative before apply within the context of the novel and more conventionally narrative art forms, and before applying them to other art forms that people might not immediately think about narrative. So could you talk about this idea of how story derives meaning from considering the interplay of end and purpose?
Yes, yes. This is an idea, just for the record, that I take from a wonderful philosopher, Francis Slade, uh, and it also influenced my teacher and friend Robert Sokolowski, so I'm depending on their thought for this. When Aristotle in the Poetics asks, what is it that poetry imitates? He says in his usual laconic fashion, he says, human beings doing stuff, rough translation, human beings in action, as it's usually translated. I extrapolate from that thought in my book, I think fairly, in saying that all the mimetic arts are imitating human beings in action. Human action is not random. Human action is always a quest for the good and for the ultimate good. There is a story in human existence, and mimetic art is imitating that story. And we see that, as you said in your question, we see that most obviously in narrative arts, in novels and short stories and plays and whatnot. Now, in any story, well, most stories, I should say, because not all stories are of the same kind, but stories that we find typically in the mimetic tradition, there's going to be this interplay of purpose and end. The protagonist, the chief actor in the story, is going to have some want or desire. In other words, a purpose, right? So Tom Cruise's character in the Mission Impossible movies, he's got to find the bad guy who has the device that's going to control, all the governmental computers all over the world or whatever. He needs to stop the bad guy, capture the MacGuffin. That's a purpose. Human beings have purposes all the time. But what's interesting in a story and in our lives is when our purposes are shown to be measured by the human end. An end is not a purpose. An end is not just any want that a human being may happen to have. It is the goal that's built into our nature. So as Aristotle understood it, the end of human beings, our goal that our nature is craving, is to live the life of the virtues, is to live virtuous activity. And so in the best kind of story, we want to see a protagonist's purposes somehow being measured by that end. And that can be done in myriad different ways. It can be done tragically. It can be done comically. It can be done more straightforwardly, dramatically, and it can come under any number of different styles. But in some way, we want to see the character's purposes distinguished from and measured from the end of human nature. That is where the meaning of a story comes from. There's no terribly significant meaning in a character just having a want. We want that want to make sense in light of the human end.
Yeah. So following on that, when you talk about moral argument in storytelling, what do you mean by that? What's this dialectic that you discuss in the book?
Yeah, really good. A story is a moral argument, as I say in the book, but I need to be really careful because I'm not saying it's a moral argument in the way that this is an argument. It's not an argument that is made up of abstract concepts put into judgments, which are then fashioned into syllogisms in any abstract way, at least. So we're talking analogously here when we talk about stories being a form of argument. It might help to say that stories attempt to persuade us of some way of understanding the human adventure. They don't try to persuade us with statements, syllogisms. Characters may speak statements, but hopefully, if the storyteller has any skill, the persuasion of the story won't ride wholly and completely on just statements that the characters make. Hopefully, to go back to Aristotle, the persuasion is in the action. It's in what is done or not done, or what is foiled, what succeeds. Um, so there is persuasion through the action of the story. And so, as we watch the film or as we read the novel, the short story, we sort of incline, or we're invited to incline to that view of the human good that the author is offering us in the story. And and sometimes we'll find ourselves kind of persuaded, maybe sometimes against our better judgment. I remember one time watching with some pleasure one of the Ocean's 11 films, and it sort of dawns on me, I'm just watching a bunch of thieves here, and I
Yeah.
find myself rooting for the thieves,
Right.
and of,
Yep.
and of course they finesse that by having the thieves uh, in the effort of stealing from an even worse bad guy,
Right.
but nonetheless, um, I shouldn't be cheering for them. um,
Right.
there's something problematic by that, but it shows the power of a good story. Steven
And this is
Soderbergh's
where
film.
you get into this idea of simulated acts of the will in reading fiction from the reader's perspective.
Yeah, that's all part of this. So I can be sitting watching, say, Ocean's 11, and I am not, as I'm sitting on the couch, engaged in an act of theft. But in a sense, I have a simulated act of the will insofar as I am identifying and indeed being sympathetic with George Clooney and Brad Pitt as they try to knock off the casino. And that shows the power of a good storyteller, that he can get me to incline to that view of the good despite myself. Now, happily, I'm able to reflect on that and say, okay, I certainly don't want to take this film too seriously. I certainly don't want to take it as a paradigm for my own actions. So I can pretty easily distance myself from it. But that's not always the case with a work of art, especially when you're talking with young people, adolescents. They're not always able to make those distinctions, and so the persuasive power of a work can sometimes be problematic.
Right. Right. Okay, let's talk about your use of mimesis and narrative mimesis as kind of a master theory for all the art forms. And just first, as a point of fact, since I don't know the answer to this. You mentioned you were extrapolating from Aristotle in considering all the arts as mimetic and narrative. Is there anywhere where he actually indicates? Now, obviously, I think we can take it for granted Aristotle thought that paintings and statues were mimetic. But my question is there anywhere where he really implies that those art forms are narrative in the kind of mimesis that they involve?
Yeah, I think so. He certainly says in his Poetics that poetry imitates human beings in action. So poetry for Aristotle would be principally the epic, Homer, Iliad, and the Odyssey. It would
Mm.
include tragic drama, comic drama, and I would presume to lyric poetry. So all of that imitates human beings in action. I think you're right. I think we can assume that things like paintings and sculpture, I think we can find texts where he talks about painting as mimetic. And if we
Right.
go to the eighth book of his Politics, I think it's pretty clear he's talking about music as being mimetic of character states, states of virtue and vice, and of emotional states. So it's all imitative of action, and it would be helpful to keep in mind what that means for Aristotle. It doesn't just mean kind of local motion, like moving a character
Hmm.
moving across the stage. So it includes that. But human action, he's talking about it in a moral sense. He's talking about really the state of our soul. So, how well or badly our emotions, in particular, are coming under the direction of reason
Hmm.
as we pursue or fail to pursue the good of our nature, the end of our nature, as we were talking about a minute ago. That's what the mimetic arts imitate, that adventure of questing after the good. So it's probably the most, it's probably the biggest claim I ask my reader to accept that
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
I'm extrapolating from poetry, but I'm confident that that's the Aristotelian understanding of music from those texts in the
Because for
Apollo.
music is considered along with the poetic arts at that by the philosophers of that time. So my question is really, when specifically talking about Aristotle's position, is there any indication that he would really think that painting is narrative, for instance, like a painting of an object that's not a human, I don't know how much they had that in ancient Greece, but if they
Yeah.
had still lifes or anything, um, but
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they did have still lives, but I don't have that knowledge off the top of my head. Um, no, I can't point to a text where he makes the thought explicit, but it seems to me very much in the Aristotelian spirit to say that a portrait, which seems to be just sort of a static capturing of someone's face, is much more than that. That it
mm,
actually is a summing up of that person's quest for happiness, for the
yeah,
quest for their end.
yeah,
That
that's very
it's
plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not just trying to get an identification. That's Churchill or that's Lincoln. I'm trying to sum up, to use Sokolowski's beautiful phrase, that person's essay at beatitude. That is their attempt to achieve ultimate happiness. At this point in their life, are they succeeding or they're failing to succeed? I think it's fair to say that's what a portrait does. I think it's within the spirit of the Aristotelian project. Um, I think you say for Aristotle, he does mention dance at the very beginning of the Poetics as a mimetic art. So I think it's pretty fair to say that the mimetic arts are connected with the representation of 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 his understanding of the ethical, which is again our quest for happiness.
Right. Yeah. Now, of course, the arts are artifacts, and to some extent, human beings can decide what their ends are as well. So I suppose that's something we have to take into account as well. Unless
Yeah,
unless the claim is that
explain that to me.
well, in other words, that somebody could conceivably paint an object and say this is mimesis. That you can even say this is an inquiry, but I'm really inquiring about something about this object, not in the same exact way that a philosopher does, but it's more of a perhaps a disinterested contemplation than in the sense of this object is implying things about the human narrative. Now, to clarify that, we are human beings and we live in story. And so story is always necessarily going to be in the background. But what I'm questioning is whether it's necessarily the primary object of a work. And because and the reason I mentioned these are artifacts is that we do have control over what their end is to some extent. So it's possible that a painter could say, well, no, my object here is really to study this, the
Good.
being of this particular thing.
Well, keep it. Maybe it would help me. Give me a particular example of the kind of work you're thinking of. What of where an artist is concerned with something, I don't know, call it more local. He's not interested in the quest for happiness. He's interested rather in X. What would X be?
I mean, it could be a still life, it could be a tree, it could be, any number of things. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sort of taking for granted that as soon as you're depicting human beings, you're dealing with morality in some way. But of course, human
Right.
inquiry deals with a lot, and a lot other than morality, and you know, and arguably, you know, virtue is not the
I
moral
see.
virtues are
Okay.
not the highest things for human beings either.
No, indeed. Um, though I would stay with my claim because I think what may help is to say that we need to think of morality in a much more expansive way than we may be doing.
Okay.
It's not just the pursuit of right and wrong. That's a way too narrow a sense of the moral. In fact, it's probably better to use a word like the ethical, which even in English is a little looser than the moral.
Right.
On an Aristotelian view, the ethical, there's pretty much nothing in life outside the ethical.
Hmm.
Brushing your teeth is an ethical act. Flossing your teeth is
Right.
an ethical act. What we're doing here is an ethical act as well as an intellectual act. So let me bring this thought down to, say, a still life. Just for an artist to decide to paint a bowl of fruit, as Cézanne often liked to do, is to from my point of view, is to try to represent the ethical dimension of human beings. Now, why do I say that? There's no human
Hmm.
being in the frame. It's just a bowl of fruit. He seems just to be focusing on something kind of that's apart from these big, large-scale ethical concerns. But again, there's nothing outside the ethical. Everything in life, pretty much, apart from, to steal Aquinas' example, apart from maybe scratching my chin, everything has to do with my pursuit of goodness. Even putting fruit in a fruit bowl is something that only humans do. You know, the
Right.
chimpanzees don't put their fruit in a fruit bowl. And so for the painter to decide to depict the fruit bowl is to depict a human environment, is to depict a human act, is to
Hmm.
depict this is the way that human beings arrange their domestic spaces. This is the way that human beings, interestingly, like to display their food. That's a rational act. That's part of the good life. That's part of our happiness to do that. I'm not saying
Right.
Cézanne had all these thoughts while he was painting it. He probably had more compositional issues in mind when he was actually painting his still lives. But as we observers regard the painting, I think we conceive in a still life, even a landscape with no evidence of human beings in it, as what Sokolowski says, a setting for the human adventure.
Yeah. Well, I like your idea of broadening out the meaning of moral or ethical. That's helpful. I think, and I'm totally fine with the idea that all of this is implicitly present in the background of the human making of art or the human contemplation of art.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but let me bring one thing up here. You say in talking about story that you say a fight of some kind is all that story essentially is. But if all art is storytelling in some sense, that means all art is defined by conflict, and that's also a claim that I think is harder to put
Yeah.
forward when you're talking about a still life. And so, if we're
Good.
including
Yeah.
moral ends as what it'll be like in heaven when there's no conflict, then I can understand that. But it also that definition of story also might imply that there would be no art if man hadn't fallen into sin, and I can believe that there might be no novels if there wasn't a fall. But we know there's going to be music in heaven, so I don't know that that's the case with music or dance, for instance. So those are just a few thoughts that I have on this idea of story, in the sense, the quest for happiness, but story in the sense that you're describing it, in the sense that we normally understand it, involving conflict and moral conflict in the colloquial sense of that term, things like that.
Right. Excellent. Well, my ear hath not heard what music may or may not be in heaven, so I won't go to that. But you're absolutely right about this. That when you get to certain genres, and especially certain kinds of works within genres, like the still life, the burden of my argument becomes heavier on my shoulders, um, because if mimetic art is about representing the human story, and as you rightly say, I say that story is about conflict. Where do we see story? Where do we see conflict? Where do we see the interplay of ends and purposes in the still life, in the bowl of fruit that Cezanne? So that's a strong objection against my claim. Uh, Here's my response. We do have to speak analogously. We have to talk about different forms of storytelling. We have to talk about storytelling in call it more abstract ways. I would still contend that a still life of a bowl of fruit is telling a story. It's not telling a story in the way that a novel does, because we don't get a beginning, middle, and end. I would contend that what the still life does, or the portrait does, it really gives us an end. Um, it at least gives us an end as of the moment that the still life, or the person posing for the portrait, was captured. It doesn't give us the whole conflict. It doesn't give us a second act where we get all this conflict. It gives us more of a resolution. And I would say, to go back to the bowl of fruit, that it gives us a picturing of human domestic order, where conflict, at least for the moment, has been overcome, and we have a relative peace. You need relative peace in the home, to have the time, to have the luxury to display your fruit in a bowl. Um, and as we were talking about earlier about self-portrait or portraits of any kind, it's a summing up of that person's quest for happiness, at least at the time of sitting. So it's a story in an analogous way, um,
Yeah.
but I still think you can draw that analogy.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, if you present it as an end, though, to me, it still seems like the story is the context of the person looking at it, and it's more contextual than it is the object of what's being represented. I mean, because if you talk about presenting an end, you could talk about that with any human, excuse me, with any human activity, even the sciences, right, or even branches of philosophy, is that you're contemplating certain things, and you're doing this as part of the human story that you're part of. But you wouldn't say that the object of that science is the story. You would say that the fulfillment that we find in studying mathematics or whatever is an end in our story. But you wouldn't say that the object is the story. And similarly, I would say that in certain art forms, the contemplation of the object as good, is part of our end, and it is analogous to higher ends that we have, and the way in which we contemplate is analogous to higher levels of contemplation as well, like the sort of the non-discursive way in which we contemplate, a work of art, for instance. But I don't know that I would call narrative the sort of the master motive of all of those works for that reason, because it seems like it can apply to everything in various ways, but that doesn't mean it's sort of the proximate, purpose of any given thing.
I don't know. I would still stay with my argument, because again, I'm just imagining looking at that bowl of fruit, that still life, and I'm going to see it typically, with Cezanne at least, it's sitting on a table. So I have evidence. He's giving me in the frame. I'm not extrapolating from my own life, at least not exclusively. He's giving me in the frame evidence of human beings doing things, and what is very presumably a human abode. So that he's trying to capture a moment. Again, I'm not imputing these thoughts to him explicitly, but what he's giving us, in fact, is evidence of a human abode, which implies human action. Human beings make abodes for ethical reasons. It's part of our story. So I would say it's within the frame we see evidence of the human story. It's not just we're extrapolating from our own.
Right. Well, I mean, that brings up another point in your book, which correct me if I'm wrong, but people talk about form and matter, or form and content in art, and it seems to me that your understanding what form is the reverse of the way that people often talk about it, because you would say that the subject matter, in the colloquial sense, is the form, and the what we call like the aesthetic form is the matter. Whereas many people would, well, it really depends on who you're talking to and what kind of art it is, I suppose,
right,
would talk about form, meaning when I talk about the form of music, I mean the musical form of music,
right,
I know that's a bit tautological, but
no, I get it.
But, I mean, couldn't the painter, again, you mentioned, was it Cezanne, having compositional concerns in mind? I mean, couldn't the painter legitimately say, well, no, this table is don't read too much into that, because that is, I mean, you can think about that if you want, but that is the matter. That is the material with which I am making I'm making an object, because art is an act of making. It's not just an act of inquiry. Gilles Sonne talks about this a lot. He really strongly disagrees with the idea of art as a form of knowledge. And he, I mean, he probably goes too far in that, but you could say, well, this is an object. This is an object that has integrity, has good in itself. Artifacts are not substances, but one of the special things about how we experience works of what we call the fine arts is that they almost seem to have a substantial integrity of their own as objects. And again, this depends on what art form it is to some extent. So these are aspects of the way that we experience art that I think, in some cases, take a much more center stage than the narrative aspect, without denying that narrative aspect exists.
Right. Now, that's in one sense, that's that may be the question in all this that we need to talk about. And maybe it's best. There's a lot there, and I'm bound to miss a lot of the richness of your question. So don't be shy to follow up if I miss some things. But it may be best to start by maybe setting aside the language of form and matter, because it's again, those are analogous terms. They're used in many different ways. I use them in a particular way that other people don't use them. You don't use them in that way. So maybe we should just go back to that distinction we were talking about earlier and talk about the picture and what is being pictured. Mm-hmm. Both of those aspects of picturing, as I said, and I want to emphasize again, are crucial to our appreciation of art. It's an enormous mistake, as you have noted as well, to just use the compositional elements or the formal elements of the work as just a jumping off point to talk about other things. We see this in painting and music, especially in the last, 150, 200 years or so. More and more of an interest in the compositional elements of a work, of the purely formal elements of the work. In painting, Cezanne was one of the first, credited by many for his fascination with just form, right? And we see that in music, but you see it in fiction and poetry as well. People want to they at least want to reduce the mimetic dimension of the work, but then there are some artists who just want to attack the mimetic tradition in the name of form, in the name of the picture. I want to recognize what is true in Gilles Sonne's view, in your view, it's my view too, that a big part of what the artist is concerned with and what we should be concerned with as those who appreciate work are how are the parts composed, and what is the beauty in that composition of parts? So just take a real simple example. I'll take it from poetry, but we can come back to painting and music. But there's a line in Shakespeare's sonnet 116. It's the one, let me not, in the marriage of true minds admit impediments. But he's got two lines a little later on in the sonnet, if I can remember them. I love them. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his sickle's compass come. I messed it up, but it's close to that. I love the music of those two lines. In one sense, I don't care what they mean. I hear those two lines, and especially if I could hear them recited by someone with a great voice, you know, an Anthony Hopkins, a Ray Fiennes, a Jeremy Irons. If I can hear them recite that sonnet, love's not time's fool. I just delight in the music, which is to say, I'm just delighting in the formal aspects of it. Form in that sense, how the parts, how the stresses and the unstresses fit together. I just love that, and I think you love that in music. We love that in painting. You can love this. You know, Evelyn Waugh is perhaps my favorite writer. I don't love Waugh most of all because there's a deathbed conversion at the end of Brideshead. Though that's great. I love Waugh because of his sentences. I love Waugh because of the way he was a craftsman in composing sentences at the syntactical level. So I don't think you can love any kind of art without just being enamored with the compositional elements of the thing. It's just that understanding art mimetically, that's where we don't end our love there. There's more to love. Those compositional elements are bringing something in the world to our attention. In Cezanne's case, it's a bowl of fruit. In music's case, it gets more abstract, that we can talk about that. But there's something in the reality of the human condition that's being pictured there, and that we can contemplate too. Not at the expense of, but can contemplate too. So that's a first long-winded attempt to address your question.
Let's talk a little bit about the transcendentals. You have a interlude in this book that's in dialogue form, and you place the point of view of Jacques Maritain, more or less, in the mouth of a rather ditzy character, Mr. Atkins. And I don't want to go through that whole dialogue because there's a lot there, but one of the issues that you bring up is that we shouldn't see, when we talk about art participating in the transcendentals and beauty in particular, because that's the way that many Catholics talk about it. The main respect in which Catholics talk about art these days, a lot of the time. You point out, I think rightly, that we shouldn't talk as though art sort of immediately just leaps into the transcendental of beauty, and that it's this sort of like shortcut to transcendence. Now, it certainly participates in it, as does anything that exists. Right. But it goes to it through a particular finite object, and I think that is very important. I think, arguably, I have different tastes now. I'm not going to come to a position about whether you've fully, done justice to Maritain's position or not, because I would have to read some of that stuff. But I have noticed lately that I have different tastes in visual art from Maritain. I don't really like Rouault. It really does nothing for me. And it's possible that, I don't know, maybe it's possible that he is not sufficiently concerned with those particular things or with certain aspects of beauty. In his book, The Vision of the Soul, James Matthew Wilson makes the case that proportion is an aspect of beauty undervalued by Maritain. I think he follows Eco in that, if I remember correctly.
Nice, yeah.
And anyway, not to get into the weeds on that, but and maybe I'm just saying the same thing I've already said, but I agree with that point about the particularity, but I just don't know why that transcendental beauty can't be participated in primarily by the beauty of a particular work of art, or at least the beauty of the object represented, and why it always has to be a moral truth. And forgive me if I'm just repeating what I've already said in different words, but it seems to me that the particular form of that particular work is perfectly qualified to participate in that transcendental without needing a further needing a further intermediary moral step necessarily.
Right.
Again, except for in the sense that we all inescapably are doing moral acts in a broad sense when we contemplate or make a work of art, and that it exists within a framework of human ends,
right.
Which Maritain discusses as, the end of art is the good of the object, but the artist is a man,
right?
Before he's an artist.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna try to take a crack at that. So it is true. If to keep score, I do take issue with Maritain in the book. I do take issue with Jasson in the book. I think both of them are insufficiently Aristotelian when it comes to art. That was my thinking. They both have something true to say, very valuable to say. But I think they just didn't have a concern with trying when in their thinking about art, at least, with really trying to appreciate what would it mean from an Aristotelian point of view. He's not given great consideration by either of them. Okay, so let's go to the main question though. In the dialogue in the book, the main contention of Maritain, as I read him, that I'm arguing against, I have one of my characters argue against, is the claim that what is being pictured in a work of art, its object, is absolute beauty with a capital B, transcendent beauty in capital letters. So I just don't think that's the object of mimetic art. The object of mimetic art, as we have said, is men in action, human beings doing things, pursuing their happiness. And true enough, as you said, even so, every work of art, insofar as it's beautiful, is going to participate in the transcendental beauty. I'm not disputing that in the least. But that doesn't mean that transcendental beauty is what is being pictured in any direct way, or that the work of art is a kind of sacramental, which seems to be the point of view that some of the romantics at least had in some of their moods. Like, in the Catholic world, the holy water is a sacramental, it's a material thing, but it carries divine power in it. Some romantic views of art seem to view the poem, the piece of music, as though it's a sacramental, so to speak, quote unquote, such that when you read the poem and enjoy the work of art, the transcendent is powering through it, like directly. I don't agree with that. Now, the heart of your question, though, is, can't there be some aspects of a work of art that we can appreciate, see as beautiful, that aren't part of its representing the story of our quest for happiness? And yeah, again, it's those compositional elements. So that when I think about why did Cézanne, for example, was famous for kind of flouting traditional worlds of perspective. So if you look at his still life, he has some peaches and apples on the table, but the table is pitched forward. It's this in life, that fruit would roll off the table. But he didn't care about the rules of perspective. He was playing. I'm not sure I know enough about Cezanne to say what he was after exactly there, but he was playing with compositional elements, in particular um, perspective, in order to achieve a certain effect. I kind of like the effect. I can appreciate it. Let's say it's beautiful. I'm not yet thinking about all those other issues we talked about bowls of fruit being on a table in a human abode and how that's connected with the quest for happiness. That is, as you say, I think rightly, that's a very important, maybe the most important, but in terms of the composition of the piece, it's a background consideration. Because now I want to focus in on the picture just as a picture. And I want to think about what did the artist, how did he compose it? How did he use the parts? That line, I'm vain enough that I have to take another crack at that line of Shakespeare's. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. It seems in that second line, I didn't scan it, but it seems that we've got trochees and maybe a dactyl at the end. It's dying, the line. We have unstressed, stressed as we go through the line. I love to appreciate that. I love just the sound of that dying fall at the end of that line. I am not, when I just recited that to you, I was not thinking of the human quest for happiness and what Shakespeare is saying about it in those lines, but he's saying a lot. There's a whole philosophy of life in those two lines. Love's not time's full. Love can overcome death. That's the truth he wants to convey. But he conveys it with integrity, proportion, and radiance, three characteristics of beauty, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, characteristics that are also present just in the compositional form of the piece. So I think I'm with you. I want to see the beauty in every aspect of the picture, not just as it's relating to the larger ethical concerns.
Well, I just had a thought. I wonder if, and I don't know a lot about still life, but I wonder if some still life artists chose that subject precisely because of its poverty of narrative, because they didn't want that to distract from their real interest, which was maybe either the compositional form or if not the purely compositional form, the simplicity and goodness of the being of this particular object.
Yeah.
Just as simple as it is, abstracting from these other things and saying, okay, yes, it becomes richer when you bring in story and all these things, but look at just how good this thing is in itself.
I wouldn't doubt it, and I don't think that undermines my argument. In fact, it's just another way of saying there can be more than one interest. And I have no problem saying, let's take Cezanne. I don't know exactly what he was thinking, of course, but I have no problem imagining him not thinking at all about all of these Aristotelian ethical, concerns that I'm talking about. He's just thinking about, I want to juxtapose this color with this shape with this. I want to play with the perspective this way. His mind is all on what artists call technical problems, compositional problems. That's beautiful. What's interesting from my point of view is that in doing all that, he just happened to picture something in the real world. And yes, he may not have cared about the implications of that very much, but we can. That's one thing to say. Another thing that has been latent in our discussion, has been kind of in the back of my mind, is we have to acknowledge, I have to acknowledge, given my argument, not every tradition of art, certainly not every artist, certainly not every work of art conforms to this mimetic way of thinking about art that I put forward in the book. We can find artists in every one of the mimetic arts and every subgenre where they're just not thinking about that, or they are very explicitly fighting against it.
Mm-hmm.
I was just reading, just take one example out of many. I was reading a wonderful book by the cultural critic Christopher Lasch. He has a book called The Minimal Self, which I've been enjoying lately. But he has a chapter on art, and he quotes the dancer, mid-20th century dancer, I believe choreographer Merce Cunningham in the book. And he kind of wrote a little manifesto about dance in the early 50s. And it's vigorously anti-mimetic, though he doesn't use that phrase. He's saying we have to stop designing dances with tension, release, with climax. What he's saying is we have to stop designing dances that have a narrative aspect. We can't do that anymore. And his reason seemed to be, and this is what Lasch was interested in, is we don't live in a coherent world anymore. We live in an ethically chaotic, perhaps meaningless universe. Narrative always imports some kind of meaning. So we got to get rid of it, says Merce Cunningham. And I think we can find analogous voices in painting, in music, in poetry, in the novel, especially in the 20th century, where they're resisting the mimetic tradition. So I don't want to say, we talk about art very broadly, but we have to be clear that my argument is a certain tradition's way of thinking about art, and certain works of art just won't fall into it, or they do fall into it to a certain degree, but they're not trying to fall into it. For example, like perhaps the Cezanne still life, or that piece by Beethoven that I talk about in my music chapter, which is a terribly abstract piece. It's not clear at all that it's mimetic. But yet the scholar I cite is seeing in the first 18 bars, he's seeing tension, release, resolution of conflict. There's a kind of a bare minimum of narrative there. But there,
a lot of the time, this would be a point of critique for you, right? Maybe not in the Beethoven case, but in the case of Merce Cunningham, and you talked about in the book the angelic imagination and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. It would be.
So you're not saying you would probably say that maybe not the Beethoven, but a lot of this stuff is failing to be what art is in some way.
Yes, you're right. That someone like Merce Cunningham represents a rival way of thinking about art, a rival tradition.
And I wouldn't endorse what you just described of his view either, you know.
No. But again, it means that in the ideal sense, Merce Cunningham and I need to enter into a dialogue to work out the difference. Or to take another example, you know, the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett. You know, think of Waiting for Godot, Endgame. His whole work was trying to thwart the understanding that we live in a meaningful cosmos. So I mentioned Beckett in the book. So there's no way he would understand his work as mimetic, at least in the sense that I'm trying to defend. There are kind of people on stage sort of kind of doing stuff, but they're not even hardly human actions. So the point being, there are rival traditions of art. There are rival ways of thinking about art. Not every work of art conforms to this Aristotelian way that I'm defending.
Nonetheless, I appreciated, I said this before, I appreciated that how open you are to a variety of styles and traditions of art. It's not so much that you're not approaching everything and sort of judging it by whether it's mimetic or not, for the most part, so much as assuming that it's mimetic and trying to appreciate how it is mimetic.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it that way myself, but yeah, I think that is a good characterization of how I look at something. I mean, I was in the National Gallery of Art in DC a few weekends ago, and I was in the modern section and looking at the abstract expressionism, the Rothkos, and I think I was looking at some Paul Klee, very abstract. It was, the title of it I'm forgetting, but it was clearly supposed to be a portrait of somebody, but it was just it was geometric and a little crazy. But I'm not saying I want it in my living room, but I'm happy to play along. I'm happy to think about what he's trying to do. Um, and I'm happy to even to think about what someone like Mark Rothko is trying to do, where there's no human figure. It's just tones, it's just color.
Right.
It's tone on tone. There, I think he's saying, I just want to create an effect for the observer just based on what I've been calling compositional elements. Let's just appreciate color on color. Can we just do that? It's like, okay, I'll play along for
But
a
you
while.
pointed out that he claims that he's producing these deep emotional effects, which may or may not be true. I don't know how much if that is just pretense, but again, and we'll get into this when we talk about music. But for me, insofar as I appreciate Rothko, I'm far less interested in the supposed emotional content of the paintings than I am in just appreciating color as a good. Now, I
Right.
don't know if I would call that the art of painting. It might just be the art of producing beautiful colors and laying. It may be a different art form using some of
Yeah.
the same
Right.
materials as painting
Right.
to
Right.
me.
Right.
But to me, it would be, you know, at that point, and this may be a poverty in his work, but I could care less about the subjective experience of emotion that some different people might have in front of it. At that point,
Hmm.
I'm just looking at the the physical object,
Yeah, and I
basically.
think that's what Rothko wants. He wants some reaction, but just to the colors that he's putting in front of us.
Right, right,
And to me, that's like I see that as it's very reductive of the understanding of art that I've been talking about this afternoon. It reduces it to composition, picturing just the compositional elements and just to some very basic ones, color and shape.
right,
Um, okay, but those are interesting to a point. It's pretty of minimal interest to me. Um,
right.
but if that's what he's after, it's like okay, but that's not the richness of what I think the art of painting is
Right.
all about.
Now,
But I'm not ready to call the police.
sorry, you were breaking up for a little
Oh,
bit
I'm sorry.
there,
I
but
was just
it'll
joking.
come through.
I'm not ready to call the police on Mark Rothko.
Right. Well, I mean, my problem with him is not that he's abstract, because, for example, I really like Islamic art, which is
Hmm.
abstract and
Yeah,
geometrical in nature.
sure.
Um, but and I wouldn't necessarily claim that it isn't mimetic. I don't see it as narrative, but I think it is mimetic in some sense, in a broad
Interesting.
sense, and that's why I'm more ready to accept all arts being mimetic, even music, because that can be applied in such a broad range of ways.
Hmm.
Um, but but anyway, sorry, I don't want to get off on a tangent here. Before we talk about music, um, I wanted to bring up this sort of the more mystical aspect of art and the experience of art, and the sort of, because you mentioned art being as a sacramental, or your disagreement with that kind of idea. And obviously anybody who calls it a sacramental, unless they are a true romantic, would mean that very much in an analogous, natural
Yes,
sense.
of
Any
course.
Catholic
Yeah,
uses that term.
quote unquote,
Like
quote
for
unquote.
sacramental reality, incarnational, those the kind
Right,
of terms that are thrown around a lot now.
right.
So I wanted to read this quote from near the end of Pope St. John Paul II's letter to artists.
Hmm.
Um, Dear artists, you well know that there are many impulses which, either from within or from without, can inspire your talent. Every genuine inspiration, however, contains some tremor of that breath with which the Creator Spirit suffused the work of creation from the very beginning. Overseeing the mysterious laws governing the universe, the divine breath of the Creator Spirit reaches out to human genius and stirs its creative power. He touches it with a kind of inner illumination which brings together the sense of the good and the beautiful, and he awakens energies of mind and heart which enable it to conceive an idea and give it form in a work of art. It is right then to speak, if only analogically, of moments of grace, because the human being is able to experience in some way the absolute who is utterly beyond. So just a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, first, it does seem to support this kind of more sacramental view. Um, but also, I want to talk about inspiration, because this is a very ancient idea. This goes back to the
Hmm.
classical view, too.
Sure.
Um,
Oh yeah.
I believe it is in Plato's Ion, maybe, where he says he's not interested in the work of self-controlled artists. He's only interested in the work of people who have the divine madness
Right.
in, and also,
Yes.
to take another point of this, I believe in the Phaedo, he says, like, don't ask me why a thing is beautiful. The only answer I have for you is because it participates in the beautiful. Or
Hmm.
he might not have used the word participate, but he says
Yeah.
because of the presence of the beautiful. He's like, that's my
Hmm.
only explanation. So that's a very
Right.
direct
Yeah.
kind of view of it too. Um, and I think that insofar as their romantics were wrong, I think part of their problem is that they, rather than acknowledging the divine element of inspiration in art, they take the credit for themselves, so sort of like the divinized human being, or
Hmm.
their idea of God is so vague and kind of pantheistic that they can't really properly give him
Yeah.
credit, even though they
Right.
might say they are. Um, and I mean, there's a lot of things to be said about it, but I mean, this also touches on your claim that someone like Maritain is bringing art too close to the status of metaphysics.
Hmm.
And I would say,
Right.
you talk about art as the least of doctrines in Aquinas' terms, the infima doctrina. It has a defect of truth. And
Hmm.
that's true insofar as you think its sole and primary object is to convey truth. But, in terms of the relation to metaphysics, they're not doing the same thing. But the metaphysician's object is higher, right? He's thinking about being in itself.
Yes.
But the metaphysician is on the other flip side, where I would bring the artist higher up in the ranking, not necessarily higher than the metaphysician, but just relative, is that the metaphysician thinks about things, but the artist produces things. And Gregory Wolfe talks about art as actually adding to the stock of available reality
Hmm.
to
Nice.
contemplate.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, I know I just threw a lot of thoughts at you together with a big long quote, but those are kind of some thoughts I have of an aspect of art that I think maybe is perhaps undervalued somewhat in the book, if
Hmm.
not necessarily denied altogether.
Great question. Again, a lot there. Come back to things if I miss something important. And what I say, first of all, just quickly, I want to distinguish and maybe clarify what I meant by sacramental, quote unquote, from incarnational. Um,
Hmm.
I would not ascribe to a view of art that is sacramental, and I'm putting it in quotations. I don't mean literally sacramental in the sacramental theological sense. I simply mean understanding art as being a direct portal to the transcendent. That view I don't think is the case. But I do think the mimetic arts in the Catholic tradition at least are incarnational. That is, at very least, they're trying to embody truth, as we were talking about earlier, within sensuous particulars. And ultimately, Catholic artists, Christian artists, are trying to embody theological truths in sensual particulars. So, in that sense, they're very much incarnational, but that's not this. That's not what I would want to criticize.
Hmm.
Um, so that's one thing to say. Let's go maybe to the quote. That's from John Paul II's letter to artists, I believe, that
Yep.
quotation, which I love. Um, I don't think there's a syllable in what you read that I disagree with. But let's think about what he's talking about there is a theological reality, not a philosophical, not something that we can know from a philosophical point of view. He's talking about the action of the Holy Spirit working through the artist, and that's a reality I very much believe in. Whenever I
Hmm.
sit down to my work, whether scholarly or creative, I pray to the Holy Spirit. So I want that, I want, quote unquote, that muse, so to speak, working through me. And as you rightly say, in the ancient Greeks, we see, for example, in Homer, in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, he's invoking the muse. He's invoking a well, it's tricky to talk about transcendence in the ancient sense, but he's talking about some kind of divinity working through the artist.
Right. It's a pretty universal experience for artists in different
Yeah,
cultures to feel as though this is not coming from me. And
yeah,
not
absolutely.
only in the sense that I'm imitating something I'm seeing in front of myself. There's
That's
also
right.
a higher thing that's communicating through me.
That's right. And I can't, I wish I had a nickel for every time I heard just a writer in an interview talk in a very secular way about, they all seem to say the same thing, and it's true. Um, my story was not something I made, it was something I discovered.
Yeah.
And that is a way of trying to capture, the muses or the Holy Spirit's activity. Um,
Yeah.
I do talk about this a little bit in my book. I think it may be chapter 5. Yeah, imitation as inquiry and intelligence. But I'm talking about it, admittedly, at a philosophical level. I dip my toe in theological waters when I talk about the Catholic imagination in the book, but most of the time I try to restrain myself to what we can know about art by the natural light of reason. So I ask myself in chapter 5, what could inspiration be from a philosophical point of view? And it seems to me that there you're going to be talking about the phenomenon of insight, um, the creative spark, as we sometimes call it, or the creative intuition, as Maritain talks about it. And I present a theory there that I won't go into all the details of, and I take some issue with Maritain in there. But I do believe that that the artist has intuitions, acts of intelligence where there is a seeing of a certain reality that then the artist tries to capture in the work. That seems to me indisputably the case. Um, but how much the Holy Spirit is inspiring that, motivating that, making that happen, I'm sure it's going on, but I can't explain that as philosopher, though I do think even from a philosophical point of view, it makes sense to talk about something that's happening beyond the artist's control in a way. I mean, Maritain
Yeah.
tries to get into that in creative intuition and art and poetry. He's trying to give a philosophical explanation of the muse, and he has his own theory, and I develop mine. But we're trying to kind of see what the muse might be from the point of view of natural reason. That's the
Right.
beginning of an answer to your question. I don't know if I got the heart of it.
Well, I think that I was just bringing to the fore this sort of more mystical element, which sort of goes beyond not the particular, because when I think of transcending, I don't really think of departing from the particular,
Mm-hmm.
departing from the finite in human experience,
Mm-hmm.
or departing from the senses. I simply think of it as something higher entering in through the senses.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but yeah, no, I just think that breath infused by the creative spirit, the creator spirit, I think that gives some credence to the idea that art is imitative, and yet there is a sense in which an artist is making something new, not solely on his own human capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And this despite the fact that art is not a supernatural phenomenon.
Right.
I actually, if I have one area that I hope to eventually maybe contribute to the philosophy of art, it would be to try to give an explanation of inspiration,
Mm-hmm.
um, in such a way that that is fully compatible with the necessary emphasis on craft.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Um,
beautiful. I hope you do it.
and I think
Yeah.
that can only probably be done by way of analogy. For instance, we know that and also that preserves art as a natural, not a supernatural
Yeah.
phenomenon. But we know that Aquinas says that every act of the will or every act of knowledge is actually moved by God. So
Mm-hmm.
those are instances
Yeah.
of where that line between nature and
Sure.
supernature gets blurred a little bit.
Sure.
Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
anyway, that's a tangent, but
No, I like it. I like it.
yeah.
So many
I
distinctions
know that
here.
didn't end in a question, but
That's okay. I don't know if you want to keep talking about it. I'm happy to. You tell
no, that's
me.
all right. I mean, we can't exhaust every lane. Do you want to talk about music for a bit?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, so I've always been kind of dissatisfied with the classical theory of music, and to be fair, that that started with seeing certain people kind of use a crude surface level reading of what Plato says about music to kind of just like dismiss, modern forms of music in a
Mm.
kind of one-to-one manner. Well, this mode is, Plato says certain modes are effeminate and therefore, rock
Oh, I
beats are
see.
inherently sexual or something
Oh,
like that.
yes.
Um, but as time's gone on, I also just found that it didn't really comport that the classical theory of music as imitating states of soul or emotions. I should say really emotions particularly, because states of
Mhm.
soul can mean a lot.
It
It's pretty
does, yeah.
broad.
Right.
That that I didn't find comported with my experience of listening or making music. And I have sometimes wondered, to be honest, if philosophers don't tend to have a bias towards the discursive because that's their sort of stock in
Mhm.
trade. And
Mhm.
that might be part of the reason why I find the philosophical tradition on music often kind of dissatisfying, in that
Mhm.
they often seem to not be interested in talking about music as music. They're sort of only interested in talking about the moral implications of music, or the kind of the music of the spheres,
Right.
um,
Right.
things like that. But the other reason I think that um, it's hard to go just based on, say, Aristotle and Plato on music, is that when they talked about music, they didn't quite mean the same thing that we mean. It certainly included what we mean,
Mhm.
but the word music, as you know, referred to kind of a combination of all of maybe all of what we would call the performing arts. So
Mhm.
included story,
Yeah.
poetry, song,
Right. Right.
dance, drama.
Right.
So it was this very broad thing. But then over the past 500, maybe 400 years, we have this development of instrumental music, which certainly existed in ancient Greece, but was not really appreciated as a sort of an independent art form, which I think that has increased our ability to talk about music as such, not as combined with words or dance
Mhm.
or drama. Um, and I think one support for that position is I'm just reading Plato's Laws for the first time, and I'm early on in it. But I was
Mhm.
struck by when he talks about instrumental music, he dismisses it entirely, as he says it's fit for the taste of the village idiot, because it's unclear what these sounds without words are expressing. And to me,
Yeah. Yeah.
that sort of backs up my view, which is that, and we can get into the nuances of it, but which is that music is not really about expressing or representing specific emotions.
Mhm.
That can't really be the primary content of music, so to speak, because it's not sufficiently intelligible
Mhm.
to to be that. And
Mhm. Mhm.
intelligibility is, of course, very important in your book.
Mhm.
So those are
Right.
some sort of opening thoughts, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that
Oh
kind of
yeah.
categorization of music and how it affects how we read the ancients when they talk about music.
Sure. And great. Great. I think it's I think it's the case that music presents especially what we like to call classical music, that is music without lyrics, music without any story attached. So we're not talking about a musical or an opera or a ballet, but just what people like to call, pure music. That presents perhaps the hardest case for my theory to account for.
Hmm.
I think that's the case. So it's great that we're getting into this discussion. It may help before we take up your objection for me to give a very brief summary of what I'm saying about music. Um, Remembering that what I say does not apply to every piece of music ever written, but it applies to much music, including music that isn't deliberately trying to be mimetic.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm following the work of Joseph Pieper here, especially a beautiful little essay he has called Thoughts About Music in his little book, Only the Lover Sings. I'm following a wonderful, but probably not known by many, philosopher who was at the University of Notre Dame in the mid 20th century, John Osterley, and also, as I understand him, Roger Scruton, who has written a lot about music. And it's they're all interested, all those three thinkers, and then me included, are interested in the phenomenon of call it pure music, right? Just music.
Yeah.
And so let's zero in on that. So you're thinking of thinkers who think about music and they connect it maybe too quickly or too in too facile a way with the ethical concerns. But
Right.
when I look at philosophers of music, that little subculture of the academic philosophical world, I would say most of them are interested in pure music.
Yeah.
Because that's the hard case. It's kind of easy.
Right.
It's kind of easy to talk about, a musical as having a narrative aspect and all that, but
Right. Yeah. Sorry, if I can just say
sure.
to that point, the 19th century critic Edward Hanslick, who wrote this
Yeah,
this sort
exactly.
of early absolutist
Yes,
formalist
right.
tract, which I'm very sympathetic with,
Of
he
course.
says something near the beginning that I'm just paraphrasing him, but he basically says, when we talk about what music can do, we are talking about what instrumental music can do, because that
Yeah,
is
right.
what music is as such.
Right. Now, I understand what Hanslick is saying. I don't agree with him. I don't agree that what he would call pure music is at the top of the hierarchy of music. At least
Hmm.
I want to say that's arguable. I'm enough of an Aristotelian to always be on the lookout for what the commonplace view is. And it seems to me that the commonplace appreciation of music is music with lyrics, songs, in other words. Most people have on their playlist songs. And we can say they're, I'm not saying you're saying this, but someone might say they're Neanderthals, or they haven't taken a music appreciation course. It's just a debased popular taste, whatever. But I think when so many people gravitate in a certain direction, there's at least something of truth to it.
Hmm.
So I would at least argue it's something we can talk about. It's not the main point here, but I would argue that actually his song is superior to what someone like Hanslick or a formalist would call pure music. Okay, whatever. Put that away and let's get back to pure music and just talk about that. Just to finish my view, and I take this from Pieper, what I take even pure music to doing, or at least much of it, is still to be a picture, as we've been talking about it. What is it picturing? It pictures that quest for happiness that we've been talking about, but it pictures it from the inside of our experience in a more existential way. Pieper nicely says it pictures the pilgrim experience of being wayfarers. Okay, that's still pretty metaphorical. What does he mean? He means what it feels like on the inside to be a human being trying to figure it all out. So if you'll bear with me, this morning I woke up, true story. This morning I woke up not terribly, but a little agitated by things on my mind, things going on, things that were conflicted, things that there were obstacles involved. So I got these worries. So I'm taking a walk, praying, thinking it all over. Um, it's okay. We're recording this late in the day, so no, it's all good. But at the time, I I have agitation. I have deliberation going on. I have emotions. I have imaginings. I have memories. I have thoughts. And I'm trying, maybe not terribly successfully, but I'm trying to orientate all of that toward what is really good. A piece of music is trying to capture that. And what's interesting about the picturing of music is that the picture is is inside us. It's like the frame enters into our body, so that if you're hearing live music being played, really of any sort, but especially if it's sort of, pop music, rock music, and even the drums are amplified, it doesn't just wash through you like a wave. It kind of seizes you. And I think that's true even in classical pieces as well. It's inside of you, and it's like you're living with the picture, or to take Scruton's metaphor, you're dancing with the picture is sort of a person, so to speak, that you're dancing with on the inside.
I did really like that Scruton passage that you quoted in your book. That was give me something to think about.
He's good. He's good. He obviously loved music. He wrote music, and there's about 3, if not 4, books where he goes at his philosophy of music. It was as if he was never content that he quite got it. I would recommend, I've been reading most recently this little book of his on beauty. There's just a few page section of that on music. That's, I think, it's the best summary statement of his view, if anyone wants to check it out.
Anyway, go on.
So anyway, that's a summary of my view that I take from Scruton and others, learn from Scruton and others. So now let's talk about your objections in light of that. So maybe you can go at them again, or go at part of it.
Oh, sure. Well, one of them was that insofar as we're sort of taking ancient authority on, this particular mode expresses this particular, Plato doesn't even say emotion so much as like almost like virtues and vices, like courage.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, so does Aristotle. Right.
That is a lot more. That theory makes a lot more sense with what they meant when they used the word music than it does with sort of instrumental music. I mean, you already stated your position that this applies even in the case of instrumental music. But I think the lack of intelligibility is one point maybe that I should focus on, because
Yeah.
If somebody reads a novel and isn't able to tell you, at least on some basic level, what it's about, what the fundamental moral conflicts are, and how they're resolved, you would say that he's failed to read the novel properly.
Correct.
I would assume, and I would agree with that. But I've been listening to jazz for more than 15 years, and I still couldn't tell you what emotion or let alone a moral argument is being expressed by many pieces of music or improvised solos that I've listened to many times. But the music itself is highly intelligible to me on a formal level.
Sure.
And not only that, but even if I could tell you that, it would be anything that I could say that expresses would be so vague and general and subjective that it would seem trivial to me compared to the joy that I take in hearing the form of the music. And what I'm not simply saying my expression of it in words would be trivial compared to the actual form, because I know you agree with that.
Yeah.
But just that the value of it seems lower to me. And also I want to make clear that when I talk about the aesthetic form of the music, I don't believe that this is something that we only encounter on a sense level. There is, I like Maritain term of the intelligentiated sense. My music teacher and I often talked about the inner ear when you're doing ear training and things like that, you're not simply hearing it on the level of your senses. Right. You are understanding it, but again, not in words necessarily. But not only that, but I'm not thinking about those things when I play the piano or when I improvise. So apparently I, as the maker of the music, am oblivious to its true subject matter, which I think poses somewhat of a problem for our desire for intelligibility in the sort of content or the subject matter of music. So that's like maybe a starting point.
Okay. Again, a lot there. I'll begin at the end. Remember, when it comes to picturing, the person who makes the picture is the least significant element of the picturing. My argument, I don't spend a lot of time in my book, probably only that chapter 5 that I mentioned, worrying about what's going on with the artist. I'm more interested in the finished work and our appreciation of the finished work.
Right.
Now, I don't disagree with you that as you're at the piano composing, that, again, you're not thinking of anything other than compositional elements, or mostly about compositional elements. I actually write literal stories. I would not want to say that as I am composing a very dramatic scene that I hope will move the audience greatly, that I am moved as I write it. I'm almost assuredly not. I'm too absorbed in the technical problems of the sentences and the paragraph and trying to work out an image or dialogue. That's enough for the mind to be absorbed by. Now, yes, as the process goes on, of course, since it's a story, I'm going to think about that ethical dimension we've been talking about. I can't help to. But so much of my compositional energy is just on formal elements. So I'm certainly not saying that the composer's or the artist's emotional state is being pictured in the piece, because that's not what's significant.
Yeah.
And of course, it's irrelevant when we're thinking about artists who are dead. I have no idea what Shakespeare felt about anything, and I don't care. I care about what I feel when I watch Hamlet.
Yeah.
So what's being pictured there is not Shakespeare. What the musical composer is not picturing himself, though there's so many distinctions to make, but I'll finish the sentence. What the composer is not picturing is himself, right? He's trying to picture some other reality. Doesn't mean there's no connection to his own experience, etc. And also, we have to reiterate again that not every piece of music is going to be mimetic in its inspiration or in its intent. So there are going to be expressivist pieces of music that are just trying to get the composer's feelings into musical form.
And I agree with everything you've just said, but I'm saying the same holds true for me as a listener as well. I'm not saying I don't ever feel emotions, by the way, but what I'm saying is that I couldn't necessarily tell you the specific emotion or any kind of moral argument that would be really intelligible, other than very general terms of tension and resolution, which are so inherent to the music in itself that it could be interpreted in a great variety of ways when it comes to the moral life.
It certainly can. So let's go right there, because that's what I think you're most interested in, and it's the hardest case for me. Go back to the example I used in the book and I touched on earlier. It's that Beethoven String Quartet, Opus 95.
Yeah, I probably haven't heard it, by the way. So
you can find it on YouTube. Your audience can find it on YouTube. It's a very difficult piece. It is not a piece that you listen to and the emotional response just comes. I listen to it and I'm not feeling much of anything at all. In fact, I've read a bit about it, and it seemed that Beethoven wrote it. He wrote it for his close circle of friends. He didn't even want it to be performed publicly. It was an exercise, in short. It was an exercise by a composer who wanted to work out some technical problems and just noodle a bit with sound. And that is perfectly legitimate. That can produce, as we've said, that can produce beauty. And that could be what's happening with jazz. You know more about it in the technical sense than I do, certainly. But it could be that what we see in a jazz improvisation is we're seeing the saxophonist or the trumpeter, the pianist, noodling on sounds, noodling with the way that we can combine or take apart sounds, noodling with structure, in short. And that's interesting. It's interesting in the way that Rothko's juxtaposed tones are interesting. I just think that there are pieces of music where, or let's go back to the Beethoven. I think that even in the Beethoven, there is a picturing, admittedly vague, admittedly terribly abstract, that does have a narrative structure to it. And you might say, yeah, but what narrative structure? There's no protagonist. You could talk about conflict because there does seem to be some tension and release, but whose conflict? Conflict about what? You're right.
Right.
This is where I agree with you. I don't know. I don't know. It's abstract, but it does give an image. At least it may be holding on to the mimetic tradition only by a fingernail. And maybe this is true of jazz as well. It may be hanging on to that tradition only by a fingernail, but isn't it interesting still that there's tension and release? Why tension and release? I would argue because it's the nature of the human spirit to be a creature of tension and release and to make things that have tension.
But I would say it's the nature of everything that changes and moves. And one application of that is to the moral life.
Oh, okay. It could.
There's motion and rest, right?
Good point. It could be the case that the Beethoven piece is so abstract. I don't know whether the conflict in those first 18 bars refers to a human conflict or the weather. It's interesting compositionally, but it doesn't really tap into the mimetic tradition as I try to defend it.
Right. For me, that's not an impoverishment, to his piece. Granted, I haven't heard this particular piece, but
I would say it doesn't. I might say something a little different. It doesn't mean the piece isn't interesting. I just think there are pieces that are more interesting. I think there's a reason why most human beings find that piece almost intolerably difficult. And most people wouldn't want it on their favorite playlist. I think there's a good reason for that.
Although on the other hand, I think you could argue that the reason for popularity versus unpopularity is less the lack of emotional content in a piece of music, if we're taking this theory, and more the complexity of the emotional content. Because a pop song or a folk song is pretty kind of...
With certain pieces, I think that's absolutely...
The more repetitive the music is, the more that tends to, be the case, right?
I think that's absolutely the case with much classical music, and maybe even with this Beethoven piece as well. I don't know it well enough to make that judgment. But, to many ears, even a very lush piece or even a piece of Mozart is going to be really tough for many listeners to sit through for more than a couple of minutes. That could be more their fault than Mozart's. Sometimes
I wonder too if I think a lot of our specific associations of music with emotions, I'm not saying it's all arbitrary and that any music can fit with any emotion, but our association of music with specific emotions, I think, does have a lot to do with built up associations and conventions, like from seeing certain things in movies or things like that, because music, as you know, is so powerfully tied to memory as well. And so when I had this experience when I started listening to Charlie Parker late in high school, and prior to that, my music listening had been very much emotionalistic, not in the your sense, in the imitative sense, but in the expressivist sense, right? And I started listening to Charlie Parker because my teacher told me to. And I was like, I don't feel anything at all. But I was listening to it over and over and learning to sing along with the solos and memorize them in my ear. And eventually I just started being moved by the beauty of the sound itself. And I was like, wow, it completely opened up the whole world of classical music and folk music and any kind of music you could name that wasn't part of my emotional cosmos and didn't have these emotional associations that I found powerful and overwhelming. And from that point on, I think I basically had the point of view towards music that I have now, which is like basically that the emotional experience is not gone, but it's sort of secondary, and I can appreciate. I'm no less moved. It's like, well, I like the Bill Evans quote, the great jazz pianist. He said that certain pieces of music and the greatest music for him doesn't make him feel everyday emotions, anger, sadness, whatever. But the sense, the emotion is the sense of being in the presence of some kind of perfection, which for me is a more spiritual thing than kind of just like the everyday emotions. It's more purely intellectual, not in the analytical sense, but it's more purely contemplative. And for me, music is like it's like a simulation of what the highest level of contemplation is. I don't say that it just taps into that,
But
but
I
I
say
say it's an
almost,
imitation of that.
but I say almost exactly that in my chapter.
Hmm.
And I'm quoting John Osterley here. I also want to say something about Charlie Parker. Um, but Osterley says, that the best music of the 18th century, your Mozart, your Bach, Haydn, um, shows it's picturing the inner experience of our emotions coming again under the guidance of reason. Isn't that what Bill Evans is talking about in other terms? It's giving me a picture of perfection.
Hmm.
It's giving me a picture of interior order of a way.
Yeah.
That's one thing to say. I had something very close to your own experience with Charlie Parker. I don't know jazz anywhere near as well as you do, but one of my last college courses was a jazz appreciation course.
Hmm.
And I encountered Charlie Parker and found him very difficult, of course, just as you did, and grew to not a very technical appreciation, but grew to an appreciation of him. Found Miles Davis a little easier to hang on to. But
Sure.
I get that. I love that. I applaud that. That you that what you found the beautiful in Charlie Parker on the compositional level. You found integrity, proportion or harmony, um, and radiance in the notes
Yeah.
and in the structure of the notes. And that's where we do find beauty. That's a big area where we find beauty. It's just go back to what I said. It's not an either or between the compositional element, the structure, and what is being pictured. It's both.
Right.
But we always have to ask of a particular work of art, is it really struggling so much against the mimetic tradition that there's really nothing being pictured? They are deliberately trying not to picture. I think that's true of certain kinds of music. You'll have to tell me whether that's true of at least some kinds of jazz. It's certainly true of certain novels.
Well, in my experience, the rebellion in jazz has not been on that level because they're not necessarily. I think the rebels in jazz are as likely to be thinking in terms of mimesis as the traditionalists in jazz. I think
Okay.
what the rebels in jazz rebelled against, the avant-garde in the bad sense, rebelled against is the actual formal traits. So they were
Okay.
probably still thinking I'm imitating emotions and I'm doing something spiritual and things like
Right.
that in some vague way.
Right.
But that because jazz musicians are much less leery of talking about beauty. I mean, even the free jazz people will talk about beauty, like even the most chaotic sounding stuff. They still think they're doing something beautiful. We don't have the same kind of modernism is there in some ways, but it's not in the same way as happened with classical music in the 20th century. Like the discourse is very different. Jazz is much more rooted in traditions and dance music and and religion, anyway, that's
really
a side
interesting.
thing, but
yeah, that's really interesting.
yeah, I mean, I could talk about that too, because jazz also is as a side note, is I see it as the continuation, carrying the torch of high art, functionally harmonic music forward, which when it was abandoned in classical music, and the tradition of improvisation, which classical musicians used to do and stopped doing sometime in the late 19th century for some reason.
Yeah.
So anyway,
so what someone like me would have to do then is to take a deeper look at jazz and see in what is there a picturing there? Are they really trying to picture kind of that inner dynamism of human spirit? Anyway,
you said dynamism, and I think that's an important word for a possible rapprochement, and we're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes here. But first of all, I mean, when we talk about the music either expressing or imitating emotions, there's certain problems that arise, right? Because emotions, by their nature, as human beings experience them, have a particular intelligible object. But music, of course, doesn't provide a specific object. Like, we're angry because we want to defend against harm, but music can can have things that remind us of anger, but music doesn't provide the object that we want to defend against, except in maybe some very abstract, an equally abstract sense. And my contention, and I've spoken about this at length on a different episode, is that music, at the very least, doesn't represent emotions specifically, but that it contains dynamics that are in common with the emotional life. And they're somewhat indeterminate, which is why certain pieces of music can be interpreted as having different emotions, but it's not wholly arbitrary because if there's basic tension and release, there's basic physiological effects that music has on us that can fit with more than one specific emotion. But it's a particular range. It's not wholly arbitrary, obviously. You can't do anything with anything.
Right.
And in terms of the moral aspect, another problem that arises, and I remember thinking about this back when I was disagreeing with your colleague, Professor Cutterback, when I was at Christendom many years ago, that even if music does represent emotions without an object are morally neutral. So it's hard to see how you can make a moral judgment of the representation of a given emotion as such. Now, what I want to do is not sort of debate those particular points, but that's just sort of an introductory thing, is that I'm okay with the idea of music as sort of representing sort of dynamics of the inner life. I think it kind of it's made by human beings, so it inescapably resonates with those things, whether its main object is to imitate them or not. And I'd be even okay with saying its main object is to imitate them. But I think that what I'm more comfortable with is the idea that it represents these dynamics, and these can be emotional dynamics, and they can be moral dynamics, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific emotion even if I were to agree that music represents the emotions ordered and governed by reason. I still think that a particular piece of music doesn't have to represent a particular emotion to do that necessarily. Because it's a very broad reality. It doesn't really depend on the particular emotion necessarily, or even the particular way in which it's governed by reason. So those fundamental dynamics, fundamental dynamics of music, of movement, stillness, calm, agitation, tension, and release are, first of all, very universal. So I think they do. I think you even maybe mentioned this in the book somewhere, that some people have thought that music expressivity is connected to bodily movement. I mean, that has to do with the virtual dance idea, for instance. But even if its primary object is internal human dynamics and moral dynamics, I think that it's okay if it's just as much about the broad search for rest and resolution or order, because I'm totally on board with a huge part of music's value is this kind of sense of order and and surprise and order with all of these these tense elements resolving and things like that. I think that it would fit a lot more with my experience as a musician and as a listener, and with the kind of maybe the freedom of music, if it's not necessarily that every piece of music represents a particular emotion. And just to use an example from your book, you talk about somebody's description of Bach's Prelude in C major from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, and he uses the terms profound, relaxed, and serene. And these are very general terms which can be applied to a number of different emotions.
Right.
And so I think that, and there are also things that you can actually object, they're physical terms that you can actually describe the sound as calm, for instance. Like that's not merely using an analogy to emotion. Like it is actually a legitimate description of the sound waves, potentially.
That's not if you use the word calm, you're talking metaphor. You're already in a.
I agree that it's a piece of I agree that it's a piece of language that comes from a metaphorical place, but believe that it's being used metaphorically in the sense that like a lot of Aristotle's terms are in Greek for metaphysical things are spatial terms, or
Right.
they are metaphorical at their sort of substrate level.
Right.
But anyway, what I mean is like not disrupted, maybe not calm, but like not
Okay.
disrupted,
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
you
Okay.
know, I could find a more neutral word to use, I guess, but my
But
point, do you
my
agree with
point
the sort of the
is,
generality of it?
yeah, I want to address the heart of your point, and I don't mean to evade the heart of your point when I say, though,
Sure.
there's lots of, well, again, what we call classical music that pretty clearly indicates at least an emotional field that the composer
Hmm.
is trying to picture. So,
Right.
Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, he gives us very clear subtitles for each of the movements. And it may be unusual in that respect. But by titles, um, and even though by sound, a composer will indicate a certain feel, an emotional field
Right.
that he's inviting us to be sympathetic with, enter into, dance with. It's like that's one point to make, but that's not the main thing I want to say. I think I'm. I think I largely, if not wholly, appreciate and agree with what you're saying. It's certainly the case with the kinds of music that we're thinking of, very formal sorts of music, that whatever is being pictured, and I don't think it's always just emotion, it could be a mood, it could be a state of character or whatever, it gets so abstract we don't know what it is. And the
Mhm.
composer is not hiding it from us. He or she doesn't know what it is. It may be nothing more again than tension and release. And so we're left kind of with our hands in the air. Whose tension and release? Or what emotion? I feel a certain calmness, say, in the music, but that's admittedly very vague. Like, what am I calm about? What I think what's really nice about your point, you're touching on something I didn't even think about in writing the book, is that certain emotions state there's something in our inner dynamic experience other than emotions, other than our thoughts or imaginings. There are kind of,
Right.
call it, settings for those things, like calmness or seriousness, because you can feel an emotion like anger kind of calmly, so to speak,
Right.
like passive aggressively, or you can feel it very energetically and furioso, you know. Um, so there are different qualities, characteristics, even of the emotions. And sometimes a piece of music will only be capturing that kind of quality or setting. Like it's giving us calmness, it's giving us serenity, it's giving us furiousness, maybe. But we can't identify the emotion, much
Right.
less how that emotion is coming under reason. So,
Yeah.
does that defeat my argument? Well, again, it may be that we're talking about a piece that really can't be classified as mimetic, or as
Mhm.
I've been saying, it's just hanging on to that tradition by a fingernail because it's still giving us, tension, release, calmness, etc. And it may be that we're dealing with works that are just so interested in the formal aspects that the what is being pictured is just dropped out of view. Uh, I,
Right.
we can find such pieces again, not just in the musical world, but throughout the arts. Um, doesn't mean they're not interesting. Uh,
Right. See, to me, it would seem to be the case that for most pieces of music and in most experience of instrumental music, even it's really those underlying dynamics rather than the specific emotions that people are actually experiencing.
mhm.
And then if you connect it with a title or any other or words or how that person is feeling that day, because people
Right.
can have different emotional experiences of the same piece on different days, obviously,
Mhm.
then they'll specify it to something. But I do think that my you know that approach to the mimetic and even the sort of moral depiction, um I think it does fit pretty well with common experience. It certainly fits more well with common experience than if I were to simply deny,
Mhm.
deny the mimetic role altogether,
Yeah, I, I think what you're saying is plausible. I guess one thought I'm tempted to say here at the end is that it takes me back to the importance of song. I think at
Mm,
least when it comes to our ethical lives, our cultural lives, political lives, I think that's why song is so primary, because
right,
song specifies the emotions.
right.
It specifies pretty clearly the narrative that's being pictured, and we need that for our ethical and cultural and political formation. It's just a
Yeah.
rarer thing to appreciate a purely formal structure in a piece of music or in a poem or in it. People do it all the time.
That's true, but people who seek the contemplative life are rare as well,
So true.
and I think I would say, not to go too far on that in this topic, but one reason that I see instrumental music as probably the highest of the art forms is that it does go beyond the discursive.
Hmm.
It does mimic a mode of contemplation, which will be the heavenly one, which will be beyond words. We
Mm.
will not need to communicate with God by means of words. Now, I'm not going to say beyond concepts, because reading your book,
Yeah.
I got the sense that when I was reading your book, I got the sense that I may not have properly understood what a concept is.
Mhm.
I may have myself reduced conceptual to mean discursive, which isn't necessarily the
Yeah,
case.
that's not the case.
Um,
Right. Right.
so that's where I found myself being sympathetic to your critique of Maritain, because I thought, oh, I may have not realized how much Maritain was saying here,
Right.
when I
Right.
read him years ago. So, but anyway, that's my sort of view of why you could make the case that instrumental music is higher,
Hmm.
even if not more directly, certainly not more directly significant for our moral and political lives. But
Right.
isn't that so often the case, that the higher things are important to our moral and political lives, but not in as proximate a way? The higher studies, I should say,
Um,
for example,
yeah,
in
like
philosophy,
yeah,
and
the study of philosophy, theology.
most people will be more interested and more accessible to read Aristotle's Ethics than his Metaphysics.
Right.
But that doesn't mean his Metaphysics is not more primary in a sense, right?
E-
Because people
Um,
are interested. How does this relate to me? How does this relate to what I see around me in my everyday life?
right. I guess if it's what priority we're talking about. If the priority is political and cultural, I think song is primary. Um,
Yeah, so I'm talking ontological,
but
I
yeah, but if
guess.
our priority is ontological, it's worth thinking about whether the more abstract forms are
Right.
primary. We have
But
to think about that.
just to reverse my position a little bit, um, obviously song includes instrumental music.
It
So
does. Yes.
it's not like song can't have, but
Right.
the point is that when you're listening to instrumental music, you are forced to go without words, whereas people find it very easy to focus on lyrics
That's right.
instead of music, and your average person doesn't even think about music very
Right.
much,
Right.
right? So
Right.
that's
Right.
another problem, is I think music is like the redheaded stepchild. It's the most suffering art form today, except poetry, but with poetry it's because nobody reads poetry. With music, it's like it's very common, but it's like the most debased art form there is
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
now,
No, I agree. I agree. I think I said
um
something like that in the book. But I think that's where
yeah,
most people, I think just song, as you rightly said, does have that instrumental component, but it also can be a contemplative experience. And I think it's where most people find their contemplation, not in reading Aristotle's Metaphysics or listening to abstract,
right.
very formless music, but in
No, that's
more
totally fair.
popular
Yeah.
forms of art. I end my book with a chapter on entertainment that tries to underscore the value of entertainment
Yeah.
for our contemplation as a culture. That's where most people find it.
Um, can I know we're a little over time. Can I ask you one more
Sure,
question before we go?
sure.
And this has to do with critical judgment of music. Um, do you believe that it's possible to hear a piece of music and judge its quality by interpreting what you think it says about self-control or something like that? Or do you really have to judge it first by whether its form is beautiful and orderly and all of that stuff, and then you can kind of interpret it
I see.
based on that?
Yeah, it's a good. That's a really good question.
Because to me, it seems impossible to sort of judge it by its moral like you
Yeah,
could with a novel,
right, right.
you know.
But let's start with literal storytelling forms and then extend to music. If you think about a novel or a film, I know I do. I'm assessing it first and foremost on, on craft. Is this person captivating me as a storyteller? Am I lost in the storytelling?
Right.
And that to do that, you have to have a very sure command of the technical compositional elements. We all know plenty of works, maybe many films in sort of the faith-based space, where you have very ham-fisted storytelling with a truth about the human experience that's absolutely wonderful, but the composition is not so good, and it's a bad movie because of that. So because it's a made thing, because we never forget the fact that it's a picture, and we can take it as a picture. It has to be well made as a picture, no matter what it's trying to communicate, no matter what truth it may be trying to persuade us of. If it's not done beautifully in terms of composition, it's faulty, if not downright bad. So critically, yes, I'm looking after that composition before I start to think about what is being pictured.
All right. Well, Daniel, your book, like I said, it's very robust in its ability to sort of take on various questions and objections, like I pointed out. I still think the theory works better with some arts than others, but I think even in the case of music, it's certainly worth taking seriously. Like, I'm going to be thinking about that bit about the virtual person and the dance and stuff like that's very interesting to me, and that could potentially expand my own perspective, which admittedly has been quite defensively formalist for a long time. And so I'm also very much looking forward to seeing what kind of discussion is prompted by this book, by responses to it by people much more well versed in the technical side of philosophy than I am. I'm sure that it's going to prompt an interesting discussion. So thank you for writing it. Congratulations on, I'm sure, what was probably the work of many years of thought. And thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Thomas. I've enjoyed our conversation so much. Thank you again for your thoughtful reading of the book. Thank you, most of all, for your objections. I'm here. I'm just because some of the words are now between covers doesn't mean the inquiry is over. So I really appreciate you saying, "Hey, I've got some questions about this." So thank you for the robust exchange.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for listening, and let me go off. So, again, for people to remind you, the title of the book, Beauty and Imitation, a philosophical reflection on the arts from Word on Fire Academic. And I'll link to that in the show notes. For everybody who's listening, if you want to know more about what we've got going on at Catholic Culture, please go to catholicculture.org/newsletter and consider signing up for our Insights newsletter. We send it out twice a week, and it's got all of our new podcasts and also articles. I'm writing more lately, so you'll get to see my writing there as well. Thanks, everybody. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of catholicculture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.